Today you do not only get one Irish Claire, you get two Irish Claires in this session. So let me introduce you to the second Claire, Gleeson from Trinity College. Claire is an OT, a researcher, an educator, and very important, an ally of the autistic community. And Claire will talk about how we can have a better understanding of the experience of autistic women in the workplace and how we can develop neuroaffirmative approaches within occupational therapy to support autistic women on the workplace. Please, Claire.
Thank you, Peter. So it's a really very welcome good morning from the second Claire of today's presentation. And I'm delighted and honoured to be here today, this morning, to share the stories, the journeys, and the narratives of some Irish autistic women. But before I really begin, I would like to situate the study and provide some context with regard to the journey that brought me to engaging in this research and identify my positionality with the work. I don't identify as autistic, but I come to this research as a really committed autistic ally, and that is based on my background as an occupational therapist. And over those years, I became more and more involved in the Irish autistic community, professionally, but also personally. And having qualified over 20 years ago, I suppose I never wanted to work in the traditional system of what occupational therapists work in, which is really the public sector, and wanted to diversify and be innovative. And so I was working really in very innovative areas of practice, in particular in occupational therapy services for students who would be registered with disability services, and in particular neurodivergent students. And through that work was really student-led initiatives, which really enabled us to collaborate together. And one of the big projects we would have collaborated on was around developing ambassador programs for students through their academic career to support them to have experiences on their transition from the world of the university environment into the world of work. And having had this opportunity to develop programs and supporting that transition with a career pathways program, I was really more and more involved in listening to the stories of individuals as they made this gigantic transition from university, where you're a student, into the world of work. And hearing those stories, it brought an area of discussion, in particular for autistic women who I had the privilege of working with, both professionally but also knowing personally. And it's from this perspective that we decided that I wanted to look at the world of work and to listen to ensure that the work and this research reflected the values of autistic individuals themselves. So the context of work from an Irish perspective really is that we know that in Ireland we have increased policies in relation to supporting people in the transition from secondary school into third level. And that's come about by legal policies, but legal legislation, but also through policies. And so we've more and more students entering university who identify as neurodivergent. And we know that as an occupational therapist, we're interested in people's occupations. What is meaningful to you? How can we support you to engage in occupations? We know that employment is a human right, and everyone has a right to engage in it. But however, when we really look to the literature that's out there, and from a European context, that the employment rate is estimated at approximately 10%. And from ASIAM's research, we're seeing that in Ireland, from an Irish context, that 85% of the autistic individuals in their study are underemployed or unemployed. But when we look at the literature in particular, and we know that the literature, and everyone's here with the same mindset, is that there's an overwhelming dominance of male participants in the research, and autistic women have been notably underrepresented. And one likely reason for this is that they are diagnosed later in life, and so therefore really their voices are not being heard as much, but they are beginning, thankfully, to emerge in more of the recent literature. But from the literature that we do know about autistic women who are employed, we know that the women experience higher levels of underemployment and often find themselves in jobs that don't often match their knowledge, skills, and experience. And also we see that they're underemployed, but also unemployed. So we see that, strikingly, that they are not engaging in the workforce, and therefore we need to kind of explore this a little bit more to identify the career path trajectories, and not just focus on the short-term quantitative numbers, but actually their true experiences for us to really, truly understand the world of work for them. And so therefore, we also are identifying that the autistic community have identified work as an area of priority. And it is from this basis that I wanted to explore the stories that the women wanted to share. We can see from the literature that there are major limitations in our understanding of autistic women. But really, I wanted to look at the nuanced realities for these women that wasn't just a survey or a questionnaire, and albeit it wasn't participatory action research like Claire's research, it did aim to try and involve and find a way to be neuroaffirmative in its approach and involve the women in a participatory way. So I didn't want to just find a methodology that was semi-structured. I wanted to seek a methodology that really centralized the narratives of these women. And in focusing on that, we know that they're a hidden group within society. And certainly when I was conducting the research, it was tricky to recruit into the study because I wanted to find a methodological approach that would work for these women. And I chose to use a narrative inquiry method where human beings come to understand the lives and experiences in a narrative form. And we heard yesterday about stories. We all come, no matter where we're from in the world, we all tell stories. And I wanted to hear the stories of these women and value that unique and valid experience that each of the women had. So I was very much employing a storied approach, and I used a narrative inquiry approach, which was hearing the stories of the women. But I suppose coming from my positionality of somewhat an outsider perspective, albeit an ally, I wanted to identify ways of engagement and our participation for the women and the need to engage and consult with the autistic community, and in particular, the women. So I was really lucky to have an amazing bunch of women who acted as an advisory group within the study. And the real purpose of that was to guide the process and the development of the research, to explore the relevance of the study itself, to explore the use of language and the publicity of the research, and identify ways for recruitment, but later on to also review the findings and how that would be disseminated. So several outcomes came from the study. They confirmed the work was warranted from an Irish context, which I felt was really, really important. They approved the study design and the methods and the overall openness to the study. They recommended the idea around providing the question to the women at the outset so that they had time to think about this before we engaged in the interview. And also the language and how to disseminate this broadly across the island of Ireland. So narrative within qualitative research is really synonymous with verbal data generated and conducted through stories. And it must be storied, and it allows for that real in-depth interview, utilizing kind of multiple in-depth interviews as an approach. So it was intended initially that the interviews would be conducted face-to-face with women, but this study took place just on the cusp of COVID-19. So all of the interviews, the majority of the interviews took place online, which there is findings from the study which highlighted the benefits actually of conducting this research online. But the methodology was novel in a few important ways. It was unlike some traditional methods. It didn't begin with a preconceived idea, an agenda, or a rigid framework, albeit I was coming from a neurodiversity paradigm. Instead, it provided an open and flexible space to genuinely allow the women to tell their stories in their own terms. and prioritizing their voices, their sense of autonomy, and that lived experience of their work journeys. So rather than imposing kind of a set of questions, the very first aspect was, it was the first question, and it was only a question was, I'm researching autistic women's experiences of work, tell me your story. And I sat and truly had the privilege of hearing the women's stories from the way that they wanted to tell it. The second part of that first interview was then more internal questions based on what the women had to say. And then 1 month later, the women were invited to come for another interview and to bring an object to depict their experiences of their work journey. And then there was a few more questions which, having analysed the first interview, which was more of a monologue, was a wonderful opportunity to then ask and get some more in-depth information. So 12 women were recruited into the study, and consistent with the methodology, because it was very in-depth interviewing, the women's voice was placed at the centre to build a true understanding. The 12 women ranged in age from 26 to 53 years of age. The women lived in Ireland in both rural and urban areas, and 9 of the women indicated that they were employed at the time of the study, and 3 women were unemployed, and 1 had recently been made redundant as a result of the impact of COVID. The women all held qualifications at undergraduate level, but also postgraduate level. And each interview, the average interview time per participant was over 4 hours over the course of the 2 interviews, ranging up to 6 hours. So the women all had lots of stories to tell, and their stories were individual, and that's depicted in it. But for the purpose of today and having 4 minutes, to depict 50 hours of stories into 15 minutes is pretty much impossible, and to depict a person's real experience. So one of the first, one of the big things I want to look at was really the journeys, because the literature doesn't talk about journeys. We talk about a point in time, but we're not talking about journeys. So we know that the world of work is intricate for all individuals to navigate, but the stories of these women truly highly identified the varied work journeys, and unpacking the narratives revealed that the professional working journeys of the women were intricate, influenced by their college experience and past experience, by work positions that they held. They had periods of unemployment, instability, and a distinct ambiguity in terms sometimes of career direction and progression. And many of the women made conscious decisions throughout their life to navigate and manage this career path for themselves. And this is kind of depicted by some of the sub-themes. Educational paths is talking about the women's experiences of higher education and details the notable pattern of the women's return to college, often described as a safety net over the period of their working journey. The women within the study had either had all graduated, but what we could see was some of the women were positioned into a career that maybe it wasn't necessarily for them, and therefore were required to return to work. And we can see this here in Martha's statement. Also, there was a clear disjunction and misalignment of the women's employment status, their level of education, and their qualifications, indicating that the women in the study were experiencing underemployment. And as Jenny describes, it didn't challenge my mind. I don't like when I can't use my mind, just sitting there foggy in my head. So I'm going to want to be challenged. Also, we can see that there was a tapestry of diverse, varied work experiences the women described. Their experiences often as checkered patchwork, and these sentiments are echoed really by Alex, as she described her journey as being windy. And she says, I haven't really had a step-by-step journey that has gone in the right way, so I can't say when I finished college and what I actually did. Figuratively as well, the women struggled with crafting the career for themselves, knowing the directions in which they had to take, and they felt a sense of being lost and isolated. Another one of the key aspects was around the women's experiences of their perceptions of difference. And this really related to feeling different at an early age, which ultimately followed them in their trajectory of their working environment. But this was further emphasized by the perceptions of others and how people treated them. this reminds me of school with the red marks that we have on a copybook, and that was how a woman was being treated by her employers. And also the women were also late diagnosed, so that they were diagnosed in their 20s, 30s and 40s, which added challenge to actually understanding how they could manage disclosure. They also described working in a neurotypical world and experiencing double empathy problems, disclosure being complicated, and the perceived need to fit in. And this really identified this idea of how it was challenging for them. I have 10 seconds, so I'm going to move on. But what we really saw was that the women really experienced autistic burnout, and this was the consequence of navigating the neurotypical world that wasn't actually designed for them. But what we also found was that we also had success, enablers for success. A good job fit, employment supports, familial and collegiate support, and the meaning of work. So really, what does this mean? This is a conceptual representation of the women's experiences of the working world. And sorry, because it feels like visual stim and I'm going to get the red line. But if we think about the world of work for women, that these women also thrived and flourished in the work environment. However, the neurotypical world were pushing them out. And this is a message to employers and society to think about how we can become neurodiversity paradigm exists in the literature, but is it truly being seen in employment? And I think the women told me that it wasn't. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. It's frustrating 900 seconds, isn't it?
It is.
If you want to share so much. Okay, we have time if you want. One question? Okay, time for one question before we wrap up this session. Anyone have a question for Claire? I see a hand going up there.
Hi, I'm Manuela from Germany. Thank you very much for your talk. What I'm wondering of your research, as well as the one before, great research, but how would the employers and the employment service system get knowledge from the results of those researches, and how could we do something to improve?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we all have that question, don't we, about how can we actually translate our research into transformative practice. And that's really, I think, the work that needs to be done. I think the very fact that actually we're talking about employment here today, there's 2 sessions on vocation and employment. And if we look at the literature, there's very little out there. So this is just the starting process of how we can do things. I know that there's a session later on that a couple of us are going to, which I think there's some employers coming to in a panel discussion. And I think it's also the message around how we can talk about this, and we can also educate. And I think this is one of the big pieces that you can't get to everything, is actually educating, and that's one of the women wanted to talk about, educating themselves around disclosure to actually be able to advocate and have agency for themselves within the work sector. And I think that's the way how we can translate some of this research to support the individuals. And through supporting the individuals, we can make those shifts as well. I also think we have to think about employers and how we can engage in that conversation, but I think what we are doing is starting that conversation in Ireland, and I think that's evident from the work that As I Am are also doing, and how we can continue that conversation on. The more autistic people in employment, the more that employers will be able to shift and see that change, but we need to think about how we can support them.
Okay, thank you very much. So thank you all for joining us in this session. Thank you very much, Claire, Elinda, and Claire, for very inspiring talks. I invite you to coffee and tea break. I hope the queues will be shorter and the quantity of coffee larger. But if you have to queue, there's posters up there as well. Bye-bye.